Hi there, everyone. Welcome to the first content lesson for early modern philosophy. Our central goal this week is to just sort of get our bearings in the problem space. I've had you read three short pieces that I think are sort of exemplifying a little bit the problems of the time. And I'm going to try to argue that the reason why the early modern tradition is still relevant to us today is because we still face the same problems that are faced by them, right? And this is why the early modern philosophers have such a decisive influence on the way that ordinarily in the Western tradition we frame philosophical problems, right? If you're a major and you've been in other upper level classes before, you were in this one, then there probably were references to one or more of the figures that we're going to talk about, either drawing directly on their work in order to, use some of their concepts to solve a philosophical problem, or as a kind of jumping off point, right? Saying, the problem has been addressed in this way so far, and now I want to do something different, right? And so a lot of the times, your relationship to early modern philosophy is so pivotal, even if you end up rejecting their methods, right? Because rejecting the methods that are nearly ubiquitous, right, in Western philosophy amounts to a pretty radical claim. So, we want to kind of explain a little bit more about, like, what is this period of philosophy? Why do we study the figures that we're studying? Why do we study the texts that we're studying? Why do we think about this specific period as being so important to the way that questions are framed in philosophy departments all over, right? And so we want to learn something about the specific situation faced by philosophers in the early modern period. And hopefully, what that will do is allow us to see the resonance that their situation has with our own situation, right? Okay, so this is my whiteboard. I will use the whiteboard a lot in lessons. I'll try always to make sure that I read out everything that is written on the whiteboard, just so that you don't have to rely on my lighting situation or my handwriting or Lord knows whatever else can go wrong sometimes, right? So I'll be sure to read everything out. um, so at the top, we just have Introduction to Early Modern Philosophy, and we're going to begin with this definition of enlightenment given by Immanuel Kant in some readings that I asked you to do for this first week. And in it, Kant claims in the very beginning of his piece, what is enlightenment? He says that enlightenment is freedom from one's self-incurred immaturity, right? And this definition is very interesting and it's very perplexing, right? There are many things that we can note about this definition, right? The first is that there's a clear relationship between the project of the Enlightenment and freedom, right? Specifically, enlightenment is freedom from self-incurred immaturity, right? And so that raises the question, what does Kant mean by immaturity? Well, Kant describes immaturity as the condition under which you have to depend on others to make decisions for you, right? And here we can see the easy analog with childhood, right? Children are not in the position to make decisions for themselves, right? And so we entrust them to some sort of authority figure, right? And so enlightenment Kant describes not as like a specific historical period, so not as, only the authors of this period or something like that, or like a specific historical movement starting with himself or something like that. That's not his definition. Instead, Kant's definition concerns an attitude, right? An attitude where you have developed essentially the capacity to think for yourself. And this is to say, in certain ways, you've developed the capacity to be free, right? And this is really interesting, right? It's very interesting for college students in particular to think about, because oftentimes, the traditional route for the college student places them in college at around the time that they're assuming their own freedom, right? Their own immaturity, right? They're hoping to get over, as quickly or slowly as you possibly can, right? And so Kant's question has a very direct relationship to the whole mission of a university, as sort of preparing people to be able to make decisions for themselves, right? And so then early modern philosophy is often concerned with problems about authority. Because remember, authority is ultimately related to immaturity, right? Immaturity is when you are forced to rely on an authority. So in many respects, what we're going to be seeing the early modern philosophical tradition really grappling with are problems about authority, problems about legitimacy. What does it mean to know, and who gets to decide on the nature of ultimate reality? In my class, a lot of the way that I choose to present this material is that I believe that a lot of early modern philosophers are in the position where, there is the development of modern science in figures like Copernicus and Galileo and Bacon and so on, Newton included as well, right? And these figures pose an incredible challenge to the authority of religious institutions. We can see already at the specific period that we're going to be discussing, the early modern period, Europe is racked by wars relating to religious conflict. I have written down here at the very bottom, at 1517, Martin Luther posts his theses, and in 1520, he is excommunicated. And a German version of the Bible, right, is printed. That's what I have here at this very bottom of the religious timeline here. And so you can see that the church is already beset by internal fractures and divisions, challenges to their own authority. The essence of the Protestant Reformation involved taking what they thought to be the spirit of Christianity, this religious belief, individual relationship to God, and extricating it, right? Separating it from its dead letter, what they saw as the institutional remnants, right? The historical nonsense, right? That is left in, that is inessential to religion. So the church in this period is challenged internally by these fractures, right? By the Protestant Reformation, by the belief that individuals, can read the Bible in their own native tongue rather than in Latin. And in that case, your interpretation of the Bible and the scripture can come from your own reading rather than one that comes from a priest or a church. These are very profound challenges. In addition, around the end of the period that we're discussing, I have here written on the religious timeline, around 1789, we see the storming of the Bastille and the beginning of the French Revolution. And with the French Revolution, we get the initial moments of the secular modern nation state that will oppose you know, the theological basis for political power that reigned in the past, right? And then with the emergence of the modern nation state, we also see the beginnings of industrial capitalism, right? You know, the very, very early moments of it. And so the reason why everyone in this period felt that they were on the precipice of something incredibly new, it's because they were in many respects. They were scientifically, this was the beginnings of the development of a scientific method, of a distinctively scientific approach towards discovering nature through experimentation and mathematical applications to nature. It is an absolutely revolutionary moment from a religious perspective with the Protestant Reformation. And philosophy is always in this position where, given its historical circumstances, its role is to think, how do these go together? Wilfrid Sellars was an American philosopher, and he described philosophy as how things, in the broadest possible sense of that term, fit together in the broadest possible sense of that term, right? And this is what philosophy is really at the scene and meant to do, is to think about the significance of developing methods in modern science, the significance of the downfall of religious institutions, and what does that mean for us as individuals, for the position of human beings in the universe, you know, for our ability to gain any sort of stable knowledge over time. In these questions that were traditionally predominated by theological concerns, what really separates early modern philosophy from medieval philosophy, for example, is that in medieval philosophy, the Bible is absolutely determining, right, what it is that theologians can say, right? Philosophy is conditioned by theology. In this period, for the first time really, or at least the first time in the Western tradition since ancient Greece, we see the philosophical tradition determining itself, where the moments of philosophical inquiry are not strictly determined by the Bible, they're not determined by the church, they're determined by a new method of philosophical inquiry, one that is modeled on the emerging developments in the modern sciences. And so to accompany the new, a tolerant modern religion that is emerging, the new modern science, philosophers believe that they have to bring a new modern philosophy. They have to make a complete re-beginning. They have to start over from the ground up. And that is a wildly ambitious project. And this is why ultimately, we structure curricula in a way that you can really begin your philosophical education with early modern philosophy. Is that what's involved in early modern philosophy, especially Descartes, who is the figure that we're going to be discussing in more depth next week, he is the first to really simply begin from scratch, right? he engages in what we'll call a sort of methodological skepticism, where he does not allow any of the previously held beliefs to stand on their own on the basis of their authority, right? And so you can see with this, with Descartes, philosophy, right, becomes enlightened. It enters its enlightenment phase because it overcomes its self-incurred immaturity, right? It is no longer dependent on the results of theology or, biblical hermeneutics, which is interpretations of the Bible and so on, right? Philosophy has its own method, its own approach, and not only that, it can discover the meaning and significance of all of the other domains. And so that is the challenge of early modern philosophy, and why it is that we can think about the sequence of authors as really responding to a unitary problem, is because they all are really trying to engage in at least the spirit of the philosophical endeavor that is best exemplified by Descartes' Meditations that we're going to read next week. Okay, so to continue a little bit with the board, sorry, I shook my monitor a little bit there. After the problem of authority, I have written here the 3 major topics in blue that we are going to be covering in this class. And that is metaphysics, epistemology, and philosophy of mind. Now, metaphysics is the study of ultimate reality. And by ultimate reality, right, what they mean is absolute reality, right? And it might just seem like we're trading one tough adjective for another there, right? But what is meant by this word absolute, right, is that it's not based on our relationship, right? So we're not talking about like only the things that human beings can know about the universe, right? Or the things that human beings can directly experience. Instead, we're talking about the ultimate foundational, fundamental nature of the universe, right? One that is apparently indifferent to the existence of human beings, or, at least does not rely on them in any significant capacity. As we'll see, the dependence relationship for the early modern philosophers is reversed, that human beings are dependent on God, right? It's only, whenever we get even more secular, even more atheistic, that we can think that God is only one of our ideas. That happens some 60 years after the period that we look at. So metaphysics is the study of ultimate reality. Epistemology is the study of what we can know. And so epistemology is very relevant to sorting a lot of the political questions that we've been discussing, right? So can you ever gain knowledge through revelation, right? What are the conditions under which you can gain knowledge? That has a very direct relationship to the new developments in science, and it has a very direct relationship to the testimonial knowledge that gets passed down by religious institutions, right? Okay, and then finally we have philosophy of mind. Philosophy of mind is a central problem because philosophy of mind concerns our position in nature. What do I mean by that? Well, in addition to being physical things and having a body and having that in common with all other physical things in the universe, we also have minds, right? In addition to having a body that engages in various kinds of physical motions, we have minds that think and decide and judge and act and so on. And so, what is the relationship between this aspect of myself, that is the thinking thing, that these philosophers will often call the soul, and the body? And how is it, given that the methods of early modern science work, that there can be a soul in the universe? So these are the central questions that we're going to be discussing in this class. You could definitely discuss this whole period and take on other topics. Like you could talk about political theory, right? There's very important political theory that is articulated in this period, often by the very same authors that we're discussing. However, these topics are discussed, metaphysics, epistemology, and philosophy of mind, rather than political topics. Number one, because UNM has another class that is just classical social and political philosophy, and that covers these exact thinkers of this exact period, so there's no need to unnecessarily overlap. But also, I think the second, more fundamental dimension is that a lot of these thinkers believed that metaphysics was first philosophy, that it was the most important kind of philosophy, that it resolved any sort of disputes in other domains, and that it was the most important thing for a philosopher to discuss. Accordingly, this aspect of their thinking has probably had the most widespread influence. So these are the topics that we're going to be discussing. What is the nature of the universe? Is there a God? Right? Things like that. What can we know about it? And what is our place in it? We're not going to be discussing many ethical questions either, although a lot of the times we will see, even though we're not explicitly discussing ethics or political philosophy, that even these very foundational metaphysical concerns are very saturated with political and ethical concerns as well. Okay, so now to finish off, I'll just read out things that I've written and make small comments throughout. So I've written down here 3 timelines. The first is philosophy, the second is science, the third is religion. My aim is to allow you to see how a lot of early modern philosophy is really responding to events that are happening in scientific and religious history. And so you can see that philosophy comes a little later, right? Even though we have 1500 to 1600 written in our timeline, there's no early modern philosophy happening at that point, right? The first text that we're going to be discussing as an example of early modern philosophy is Descartes' Meditations, and that's 1641. After that, I've written just a few of the most seminal texts that we're going to be reading and their dates. It's not important that you memorize this, it's just important that you get a mental picture for how quickly things develop. So from 1641 to 1677, we have Spinoza's Ethics. 1689, we have Locke's Essay, so this is going to be the beginning of the empiricist tradition. We'll talk more about that. 1711 is Leibniz's Monadology. I have a soft spot in my heart for Leibniz, as you will see. I think that 1743 is Hume's Essay, and then 1781 is Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. So we're discussing a history of about 150-ish years, right? Between 1641 and 1781. And a lot of material, a lot of stuff gets written. Way more than we're reading. We are, reading a good amount, I think. But we definitely, like other professor syllabi, include a lot more reading and material. I've tried to make it more reasonable for everyone. And if you want to get into more, which I would encourage you to do the extra credit. But this is the period, roughly, that we are discussing together. And then, science and religion, we have critical points that I mentioned before: Martin Luther's theses in 1517, his excommunication and translation of the Bible, 1520 and 21. Other things that I also mentioned: the storming of the Bastille towards the end of the period that we're discussing. Other two things on the religious timeline: Giordano Bruno, who is a philosopher, was burned at the stake at 1600, and Galileo's Inquisition. I think I have the wrong date here, but it was a couple of decades later. It was something that Descartes witnessed himself, and it made him reconsider his philosophical endeavors. Okay, so to do the science timeline really quick, we talked a little bit about the importance of the Copernican revolution. That's 1543. And then you see developments in Galilean astronomy soon after. Descartes invents analytic geometry. We'll talk more about that next week, but if you recall the Cartesian coordinate plane, the XY axis, that Descartes invented. And then later you have Newtonian mechanics, right? So you get foundational laws of classical physics, and you get the development of calculus and the dispute between Newton and Leibniz over who invented it. So I hope that this video has helped give you a little bit of context for the things that we're going to be reading together. If you struggle a little bit with the Pascal, the Montaigne, or the Kant, just know that it's not important that you have an extremely thorough understanding of those texts. They are just important to set the stage for the sort of problems that we're going to be examining in other figures. But if you have questions about any of them, I hope that you please feel free to post those questions to the discussion forum, and we'll have the opportunity to have a synchronous discussion, I believe in week 3. Okay, thank you all. Bye.